Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for September 2nd, 2022. I want to begin by noting that there was a problem yesterday with the Facebook posting of the daily update, that is the September 1st update. And I would encourage people to go back to it and listen to it and watch it, because what I took up in that one is this whole question of what is the precedent for the Great Reset? Where did this idea come from? And I identify it from the Paul Volcker Trilateral Commission policy of controlled disintegration of something called Project 1980s. And I go through in some detail how this thing was launched during the Carter administration by the City of London and Wall Street with the policies of free market, free trade, deregulation, privatization, and so on, which set into high gear the shift from a physical economy from before August 1971 into the speculative bubble economy that's collapsing today. So I would encourage people to go back and look at it because it has a lot of important, pertinent historical background to give you a better understanding of what is involved in the Great Reset today, including after Jerome Powell cited the Volcker precedent as something he must do if there's not enough pain in his high interest rate policy yet, that he may have to go to the Volcker policy, which raised rates to over 20% in the early 1980s. Now, that brings up the argument, and a lot of people have asked me, how do you answer the question when they say there's no alternative but to bail out the system, or to let it go broke and everything collapse and start over again? Well, there is an alternative. The Great Reset is a global banker's dictatorship, a central banker's dictatorship. It's not necessary. It's not anti-inflation. It's to push a green anti-growth policy on humanity. Now, the reason I say it's false to say there's no alternative is an alternative is coming into place, as we've been pointing out. There's a battle underway right now between this collapsing imperial system centered in London and Wall Street and the emergence of a new financial system of sovereign nations working together, collaborating for global economic development based on physical economy. Now, this is going to be the central theme of our September 10th and 11th conference, the Schiller Institute online conference, titled Inspiring Humanity to Survive the Greatest Crisis in World History. This will be an online conference. You can register for it at the link at the bottom of the description section that you'll have up there today. And I'd urge people, if you want to answer the question of what is the alternative, watch this and participate in this event coming up. Now, it's clear there's an attempt to stop this new system. That's why there's war. That's why there's provocations, especially against Russia and China coming from the NATO forces. That there are agreements being negotiated today and being put into effect today between countries such as Russia and China, India, Argentina, Brazil, the so-called Global South. And the Global South is the former colonial sector that many of which nations were involved in the non-aligned movement in the 1950s and 60s. They don't want to be forced to submit to the Great Reset and the Green New Deal. Now, this brings me to one of the Friday questions, which came up at a European Union foreign ministers meeting in Prague. After discussing the importance of sticking to the policy of the war in Ukraine, the question came up, well, why are African nations siding with Russia and China? Why are they not accepting the leadership of the so-called democracies of the West? Well, the answer is very simple. Russia and China are providing aid for the economic development of nations of the South. Just as an example, Russia is building a nuclear power plant in Egypt. China is building dams and railroads and roads and power plants and water management systems throughout Africa. And the European Union, on the contrary, made promises 6 months ago at the EU-African Summit, but they've delivered nothing. That is nothing positive. What they have insisted is that the African countries go green, which means to stay with low intense energy systems that can't support economic development, and to put austerity first, which is pay the debt first. That's not acceptable. Now, in reality, it's the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the European Union, and the United States and United Kingdom that are the ones responsible for the so-called debt trap. This has been the policy of the last 50 years, to force these countries in the developing sector into debt and then demand that they pay the debt first before they invest in infrastructure, in agriculture, in healthcare systems, and so on. That's the debt trap. The Chinese and the Russians have shown a willingness to renegotiate debt, in some cases canceling debt. The best example of the Western policy is what's going on now with Sri Lanka, where in order to get a loan from the International Monetary Fund, Sri Lanka is going to have to agree to spend nothing to help their population, nothing to rebuild their nation. So it's a simple question. Why is this happening? Well, for a complete lack of support from the European Union and the transatlantic. Now, an example of this is the same thing is happening not just in Africa, but in Central and South America. China has become the first or second largest trading partner for Latin American and Caribbean countries, according to an article that's posted on something called railfreight.com. And according to this article, this has produced a, quote, mayday in European headquarters, with the EU deciding they must take immediate investment activity to mitigate China's global expansion, unquote. Now, what is China's global expansion? Trade, exports, infrastructure, not military. Now, the question that's posed by this is, instead of freaking out about it, and instead of being prepared to go to war with China over Taiwan, to continue the war with Russia over Ukraine, why not work with them? Why not work with the Belt and Road Initiative, pool resources, create opportunities for companies that engage in infrastructure development in the United States and Europe? God knows they're not being involved in infrastructure in Europe and the United States. The infrastructure is falling apart in these countries. Look at Jackson, Mississippi's water system. Look at the problems with the German railroads. All you have to do is realize that it's a lack of investment that's adding to the problems. And where does the money go that's created? Because trillions of dollars have been created in liquidity. It's going to the speculators, not to the physical producers. So the answer to this question of why is Europe so unpopular in Africa, why are the African nations not supporting the sanctions against Russia, is because they see Russia as a potential ally in creating a new system which can get them out of the post-colonial oppression they've been in since the 60s and 70s, when most of the colonies were set free, although kept under bankers' dictatorship. Now, there's a second question that was sent in by several people. What can be done to protect those who are on the Ukraine hit list? Now, the most important thing is that we have to expose what's the truth about what's happening with Ukraine, the arming of Ukraine, the deployment of the Ukrainian forces, not to defend the Ukrainian nation, but to weaken Russia. As was admitted by Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, he said, our goal is to weaken Russia. Well, how are we weakening Russia? Russia actually is surviving the sanctions. Their economy is starting to grow again. The countries that are being damaged by the sanctions are the European countries and the United States, and the country taking the biggest damage in this war is Ukraine, which we're supposedly helping. So get out the truth. Now, that includes understanding what I presented at the beginning of this update, that the economic development perspective is what is the ultimate solution for Ukraine, a neutral nation serving as a bridge between East and West rather than a battering ram against Russia. Now, in order to be effective in this fight, you have to get informed. The newest issue of the Executive Intelligence Review, which is online as of today, has an article, quote, "Global NATO orders a hit on advocates of peace," unquote. And it tells the whole story of the Ukrainian so-called Committee to Combat Disinformation and the hit list that they've produced. It goes through the role of the State Department, the non-governmental organizations, and especially British MI6 in doing the targeting, including the targeting that included the killing of Daria Dugina in Moscow nearly 2 weeks ago. Now, secondly, speak up. Don't be intimidated. Most of the people you talk to who think they have informed opinions know nothing. They're just spouting what they heard on CNN or on MSNBC or on Fox. Have you noticed most of the problem in the Congress is the two parties agree on this war policy? Now, that's quite interesting. And at the same time, you have a beginning of a split developing where some of the Trump Republicans are starting to speak out against the war, too timidly, but nevertheless, they're not going along with it. So you have to ask questions like, why is Charles Schumer so committed to providing funds to run the Ukrainian government when that government is targeting his opponent in the upcoming Senate election, Diane Sare? Be open, be vocal, be courageous. That's how you make the changes that are possible. And those changes include a break with a collapsing financial system that's pushing the world toward war and chaos, and instead moving into a new financial and security architecture, a new Bretton Woods, which would mean cooperation for the development of sovereign nation states. Not a dictatorship, not a one-size-fits-all, but an opportunity for sovereign states to work together for the benefit of their people. So thanks for joining me. Again, if you haven't seen yesterday's update, I would encourage you to go look at it. It's up on Facebook and on YouTube now, and BitChute. And thanks for joining me. See you next week.